Thank you, John. Thank you very much. As I heard all of these accolades about Florida, I have to admit I feel the looming presence of my mother behind me. And she's saying, don't brag. So my first point that I want to make is I'm proud of the success we had. Directionally, Florida's on the right track. But like Michigan, Florida has a long way to go as well. And I think one of the lessons learned in this is a long-term journey. Success is never final and reform is never complete. If you start with that attitude and you have passion and commitment and think about the benefits of a system that yields more students learning to read at grade level and understanding math that graduate from high school being able to go on to college or be career ready, and you put it in a human context, this is really important. This work that you all are committing to do from a policy perspective is very important. In 1998, I ran as a candidate. I decided in order to do this, I'm kind of intellectually curious. I'm an introvert. I'm a policy nerd. So I told the people if I was going to run, I wanted to do it in a way that made it at least purposeful for me. That meant I would work at night raising money and going to the Republican Club events and all that, and I would play like I was really happy doing that. I learned how to do that as an introvert. We kind of overcome this stuff, and I became an extroverted introvert, I guess. But I decided I wanted to learn, so I decided I was going to go visit 100 schools. And I found it so incredible that I went to 200, and then at the end I ended up going to 260 schools in less than a year. And what I saw validated my belief that we needed to be big and bold rather than incremental in our approach. So I laid out exactly what I wanted to do in 1999 as a candidate in 1998. And I think while today we're living in a different political atmosphere where it's all about pushing someone down to make yourself look better rather than advocating policy, my first admonition to you all is you have a responsibility as citizens of this incredible state and this beautiful region to encourage elected officials to say what they're going to do and give them the encouragement and support when they actually do that and have the courage of their convictions, because it's the only way that you're going to get meaningful reform done. So one of those trips, I'm in Seminole High School, which is in Sanford, Florida. I'm in the back of this big high school, probably had 3,000 kids. By the way, 67 school districts. In Florida, people complain because that's too few. I guess in Michigan, you think it's great, so be careful what you wish for in the governance structure. In any case, if you've gone to high schools, this was in the back of the high school. It was in an antiquated lab back then. There wasn't a lot of fancy computer stuff. And a kid was looking at a computer, practicing at that point, the test, the PSAT test or whatever it was called, which was an 8th grade level test to graduate from high school. Wow. And we were one of the few states that actually had a high school graduation requirement, 8th grade level. Here's a kid who had, if he didn't take it, didn't pass the test the next day, wouldn't graduate from high school. The question was, a baseball game starts at 3 and it ends at 4:30. How long is the game? And he couldn't answer it. I asked if this kid, his name was Santiago, so I asked, was he recently arrived? And the answer was no, he was a longtime student in the Seminole County School District. Think about that. Think about what it's like to not be able to think abstractly to conclude the story. Now, of course, there are people, when I ask that question, give that question out, they always immediately go 9 innings. But the simple fact was he didn't have that answer either. That kid didn't graduate, and he was one of the 50% at that time in 1998. We had the lowest graduation rate in the United States. 50% of our kids didn't graduate. With an 8th grade level aptitude test and grade inflation that exists today just as it does in Michigan, where kids are passed along with low expectations, because God forbid if we don't intervene in the child's life, think of their self-esteem, how bad they feel if we don't intervene and give them a higher quality education. We don't think about the outcome of that, meaning that a child like Santiago won't ever be able to live a life in purpose and meaning. And frankly, that challenge today is dramatically different than it was in 2000 or 1998 when I was wandering around as a candidate. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Florida story because, as I said, it's something that I think there are elements of our story that could be applied here. First of all, there are no silver bullets. Accountability truly matters, but accountability creates pressure on the system, and the dynamic nature of school choice puts pressure on the system to compel people to be able to do things differently. If everything is fine and all society's problems are excused away outside the classroom, and there's no transparency and no accountability, you get a very bad result. Here's the Florida student population. We have 58% of our students are qualified for free and reduced lunch. We're like the rest of the country. At least the rest of the country will look more like Florida going forward. We are a majority-minority student population. 10% of our students are English language learners. English is their second language. And our kids near or at the poverty level are roughly slightly, or 200,000 students more than what exists in the entire student population in Michigan. So in 1999, based on, I ran and I won, and so I said, I have a mandate. I'm not sure this was the reason why I won, but the campaign was all about these ideas. And I had a legislature that realized that their success required them to implement this as well. And so what did we do? The first thing we did is we graded schools A, B, C, D, and F, because moms and dads know an A is a lot better than an F. Pretty simple and a pretty powerful transparency tool and accountability. The second thing we did, and you'll see that we added to this, was we created school recognition money. So when a school showed improvement year to year or was an A, the school got $100 per student directly into the school. No cut by the bureaucracy, just directly wire transferred in. And they could use it for anything they wanted. There are all sorts of people wanted to create rules around this. God forbid that someone would go to Brazil, have a huge party. The cynicism that exists in public education is pretty crazy. My attitude was, if they were going to be that stupid, let them be stupid, because they're going to be fired by doing something like that. And guess what? The largest bonus program for teachers in the United States today is Florida school recognition money. $170 million goes out to all these schools. 90% of it goes to teachers in the form of a bonus. The unions hate it. The teachers love it. And the net result is that we're aligning our economic interests with what we want more of. We want improvement, so we put money behind that. And that, in whatever form of accountability you have, I think that's an important element of this. We eliminated social promotion in third grade, and we meant it. We didn't just talk about it. At the time, we had about 29% of our students were below basic readers. That's a fancy term for functionally illiterate. And if nothing happened in the 2 years that we implemented this, then theoretically, 32% of all Florida's third graders would have been held back in fourth grade. That would have created chaos, but I believed that if you created a real gate, not just a theoretical one, between third and fourth grade, that everybody's interests would be aligned towards making sure that there was greater literacy. And the net result was that we created a pre-K program that was literacy-based. Kindergarten, first and second grade teachers were taught how to teach reading, because our schools of education, at least in Florida, didn't really teach teachers how to teach reading. And how, it's basically the most important thing that goes on in elementary school. And they created strategies for each child long before the end of third grade, because they knew the consequences of that many kids being held back would be shameful. And the simple fact is, administrators and teachers and parents love these kids. They want these kids to succeed. It's the system that's broken around them, and by changing the system, we aligned everybody's interest in the right way. We created financial incentives as we went along in high school, and I'll show you the results of that. And then we raised academic standards. Our lousy 8th grade test went to a 10th grade test. To graduate from high school in Florida today, it requires passing an Algebra 1 into course exam and a English language arts exam for 10th grade. Still not where I believe it should be, because success is never final and reform is never complete, and I think the bar should be raised even more. So, one of the elements of our reform, beyond accountability, was that we, in every way possible, we opened up our system to empower parents to make decisions for their children. For the life of me, I have a hard time understanding why this is such a radical idea. In the places where there's great resistance to it, you're told that the world will come to an end if a mom can go to a private school funded by a corporate tax scholarship, or a child with a learning disability could go to the school of their choice empowered by their parents, or having universal public school choice, which Florida has, or having a robust charter system. All of these things inside of an accountability system yields, in my mind, a much better result. Florida's the largest voucher program in the United States is our universal pre-K program. Every fourth grader is allowed a half day of school, paid for by the state, embedded in our Constitution, and I believe at least that this is helpful to accelerate the learning for kindergarten, first and second grade, and to deal with these huge gaps that exist when 4-year-olds turn 5 and go to kindergarten. We also have the largest virtual school in the country. At one point, there were 500,000 courses administered. Florida Virtual School is owned by the state. It's not a for-profit venture, and they only get paid if there's course completion. Imagine having an education system where you only got paid if the kid did the work that you expected. My guess is you would have a lot more kids doing the work that was expected. So the school choice programs, 46% of students go to a school that's not dictated by the monopoly, but empowered by parents. And my expectation is this will continue to grow to the point where 3/4 of all students will be going to a school of their choice along with their parents. One of the elements of our reform was that it was long-term. We didn't just pass a law and check the box and move on. This was not popular, by the way. This required a long-term struggle. There were a lot of vested interests that felt really offended by this and felt threatened by this, and so it required a diligence to make sure that we continued to work. And so I'm going the wrong way. Excuse me. So if you look at the principles of our grading system, A through F is clear and transparent, easy to understand. Other states have accountability systems. California has a really cool one. It has all these cool California colors like mauve and chartreuse, all these colors that kind of look like California thinks. And the net result is no one knows whether the school is doing well or not. And that's exactly the way they want it. A through F being totally transparent is a far better way to do it if you do it right. It requires having data. And Florida has the best data system in the United States. And we have longitudinal studies. Most of the big education research being done today in K-12 is being done in Florida because we've had data that's been collected. You can track a 4-year-old in a pre-K program through K-12 into the community college and university system, and by teacher, and then ultimately by the job that they get and the income that they have. That is what you ultimately need to have, protecting privacy rights, of course, to be able to have constant focus on how you improve. We tried to balance the difference between how you do to the standards and growth in learning. I think it's important to do both. If you just have your proficiency numbers out there, the argument, and it's a compelling one, is that low-income kids will always fare poorly in an accountability system that does not include learning gains. And I would urge you, if you're going to pursue this, to include both as part of this. Because ultimately, you want every child to reach grade level improvement. If you believe, like I do, that every child can learn, it doesn't matter where children, the level of income of their families, or the color of their skin, or whether they have a vowel at the end of their name, if you believe, like most people I know believe, then you need to have a focus where the aspiration is that every child ultimately gets to grade level by the time they graduate from high school. We focused also on the performance of the lowest 25% of every school. So if you're in Coral Gables, or Palmetto High School in Miami, where I live, which is a relatively affluent place, and your children in the bottom 25% don't achieve learning gains as measured by our system, you cannot be an A school. The simple fact is this evens out, this focuses on every child, and it also creates a equity issue based on income that I think is appropriate. The other element of our plan, which the state of Florida needs to do this again, is that the minute the bell curve started moving to too many A's, we raised the bar. You don't want to have a system where every school is an F, and you certainly don't want a system where every kid is above average and every school is an A. The natural tendency is to celebrate A's and try to ignore F's, and by moving the bar to the right, if you will, you end up creating a bell curve that I think is important to create a much more dynamic system. And finally, and the other element of this is, and this is where, if you were creating a system today, the focus ought to be, how do you assess, when do you assess, and when does the information get back to parents and to administrators, so it's not just a tool to measure where a student is at any given time, it's also a diagnostic tool to create an environment of continuous learning. The challenge with paper assessments, which is what we had in 1999, was that the test would come back in the summer. We paid a lot of money to make sure it did, and the test was administered in March or April. The net effect of that was, after the test was given, there was a lot of videos being watched, or back then DVDs being, 8-track cassettes being watched, and the net effect was that you didn't have the kind of rigorous learning environment that would be important. Today we don't have that challenge. Today you can assess near the end of the time, or you can assess continuously, ultimately, to move to a competency-based model. But having accountability around the assessment is essential. Don't let everybody tell you that we're over-tested. The simple fact is, if there's over-testing, it's not because of the end of coursework, it's because school districts feel compelled to be testing along the way. The legislature can solve that problem by having total transparency on who's responsible for the tests. But the whole effort shouldn't be to kill the accountability system, because without measuring, you don't care. And the net effect of that, as Dr. Perry will tell you, much more eloquent than I can, the net effect of that is that we're going to create huge social challenges for our country going forward. So, I mentioned the strategy of this is important as well. First, you've got to fund the reforms. Generally, the way the legislatures across the country work is you have a funding formula, you put the money in through the beast, there's a little meat grinder, it comes out, and you get a per student amount. It goes to the school district, they spend it the way they want, and the net effect is that's the end of it, and you get the results of 50% of the money not going into the classroom, as was depicted previously. A better way of doing this is to fund the things you want to do that will create rising student achievement. Fund the reforms first before you fund the beast. And that's what we did in Florida. The school recognition dollars are a good example of that. And the rewarding success in general, bonusing teachers for AP classes, IB classes, and classes where students can earn a nationally recognized certificate. All of these things, ending social promotion, creating literacy coaches in every school. We funded the reforms first. And from a policy point of view, it is essential that that be done. The minute, and the other element of something like this is, in my opinion, there should be a high degree of impatience. There shouldn't be an attitude, well, we can phase this in over 3 or 4 years. The states that go for changing their accountability system and phase it in over 3 or 4 years, a whole lot of them end up in the 3rd or 4th year when it's supposed to be implemented to unphase it, basically to stop what they're doing. If you believe that this is important, that children can learn, then the attitude ought to be, let's do it yesterday. Let's don't wait 3 or 4 years. And the net effect, now you got to find candidates running that are crazy and don't mind having their, have thick skin, because all the thing that I heard the most when we implemented this was, it's not fair. It's not fair. Everything's not fair. Well, the net effect is, if you accept that mantra, then the end result is, it's not fair that only a third of our children are college and or career ready, and 2/3 aren't. Talking about equity and fairness, that is going to lead to a social strife in this country, the likes of which we can't even imagine. So my sense of importance and urgency I think is important. And when you have success, raise the bar. Assume that children are smarter than we give them credit for, and that our teachers are dedicated, and that if you have an accountability system where you have rewards and you're funding these reforms adequately, they will perform. So here's an example of how that works. You can see the line, the gray line with the bubbles is where we raise the bar in some fashion, and occasionally there'd be a bump down and then a bump back up as the system was basically adapted to these new changes. Part of the problem in Florida is that there's a lot of change, and it's important to do that. New guys come in, new gals come in, they want to modify the system, but you can't have too much change because it's important for parents to have total understanding about how this system works. But the net effect of this is that would lead me to believe that it's time to raise the bar again when only 7% of our schools are D and F. There's been great improvements, but the reality is that we don't have 100% of our kids college and career ready, and so some of these schools that are C's and B's probably are deserving of a little bit of a lower grade to challenge the orthodoxy of what's going on in those schools. So here's what we did in third grade. 29% of our students in 1998, I believe it was, were functionally illiterate. We created the policy in my second year. That number went, you can see the kids that were held back. Traditionally, it's about 3% across the country. Florida was no different. In 1 year, it went up to 14%. That was my re-election year. A lot of moms, at least 14% of the third graders, moms weren't too happy with their governor. But I made the case that what we were going to do is assure that everybody had a chance to acquire knowledge in fourth grade. We created summer schools again, which we had abandoned a long time before. We created small exceptions, portfolios and things like that to allow for kids that had troubles taking tests to do a better, to be able to, if they'd mastered the material, to move on. But you can see the results of having a command focus and a real gate in third grade. And that, perhaps more than anything else, helps explain the NAEP scores that you've seen. We created incentives for teachers to give AP classes and bonus them when up to $50 per student when a kid passed the test. And here are the numbers from 1991 to 1999. There was a 69% increase in exam takers, 100% increase in those that passed with a three or above. And in 99, we funded these programs, we recruited the teachers, we created a partnership with the College Board, and we've had an explosion of the number of students taking college-ready coursework that otherwise did not exist. In the past, if you were in an underperforming school or in a low-income neighborhood, you didn't even take the PSAT. And so in Florida, we funded all students take the 10th grade PSAT, which is a good leading indicator of the potential of that child to be able to take more advanced coursework and go on to college. And the net results of these numbers, these are just lights out numbers. This perhaps is what I'm most proud of, because it shows if you fund these reforms, it breaks the myth that some kids can learn and some kids can't. And by giving students and teachers a chance to break that mythology, there are a whole lot of kids now going to college because in 9th and 10th grade, they were told that they were smart. They were capable of doing something more meaningful in their lives. And if you look at in the last 5 years, we've added industry certifications. This is a place where Michigan has done really good work. And I would encourage you to look at using your accountability system to accelerate that work at the high school level. So in 2007, 2.2% of our high school kids were taking a course that had some nationally recognized certificate in it. And then we included this in our grading system, and the numbers have gone from 2.2% to 43.4%. Teachers are bonused for administering these classes as well, $50 to $100 per course. And the net effect is teachers are rewarded for a job well done, and students are increasingly graduating from high school capable of going to college without remediation and having something of relevance for them to start their work as well. So, I can't brag too much, but I'm going to have to do a little bit here. This is the last fourth grade reading test where Florida was the only state on the NAEP test that showed any appreciable gain between 2015 and 2017. If Florida's Hispanic kids were a state, they would do better than or equal to 38 states. Don't let anybody tell you that kids can't learn. if Florida's African-American kids were a state, they would do better than Louisiana, New Mexico, and Alaska. If you take the free and reduced lunch students, look at the numbers there. 17 states, we were better than or outperformed 17 states, including, sadly, Michigan and California and Texas, all my favorite states. If you take on math, the similar kind of results, 35 states. African-American kids in fourth grade math do even better than on reading. Free and reduced lunch kids on math also show significant gains in compared to the average of other states. So, how can Michigan's accountability system be made better? It ought to be A through F. It ought to be, you ought to measure proficiency as well as where you do to the standards. You should include, I think, growth of the lowest performing students in any given school, and you should have automatic increases in the bar for school grades that when there's great improvement. And I think you need to have a system that is more transparent to give this information to parents so that they can be, as they always are, the first teachers of our children. They know exactly what they can do to help over the summer so that a child comes prepared to be able to have a year's worth of knowledge at a year's time. And finally, let me just show you the comparisons. My mom wouldn't like me to do this, but if you look at this over the long haul, the results are there. Every 10, the scale scores go up 10, that's a grade level. So Florida's kids have gone 2 grade levels up compared to where they were in 1998. Similarly, for 8th grade reading, these numbers just show that we started at way below, way back, which helps explain why we've had great learning gains. If you start from a low base, you can get a better result. But imagine the states going forward that do these things going forward. They'll be the ones where the investors are going to invest in the communities. They'll be the ones that won't have to deal with the huge shortage of qualified workers. They'll be the ones that have more vibrant communities as well. The final thing I'd say is, for those that don't believe accountability works, that somehow we're narrowing the curriculum in order for kids, you know, we're just a bunch of test takers in Florida. This is the NAEP test. You can't teach to the NAEP test. The idea that somehow you can just create this miserable learning experience for students, and that's why it's a horrible thing, is just not accurate. Don't buy into it. Have high, lofty expectations for every kid, and make sure that there are art classes. Make sure that there's a vibrant curriculum. Make sure that civic education has a high premium in your schools. But don't give up on having high expectations for every child. And don't ignore the fact that accountability truly, truly matters. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Governor. That's
Yeah.
a remarkable accomplishment, what you have done in Florida.
Now, if we get our football teams back, that'd be
right, well, of the two, I'd pick your success. I've gotten a few questions, but please raise your hand if you have any questions. Put on your card and then pass them up, and then we're going to collect them and try and get through a few of them here. So looking at this, let me start with the first one. Do your schools teach phonics in Florida?
Yes.
They do. Okay.
In
Great.
fact, those weird Common Core standards excluded phonics, which I never understood why that was the case, and we put them back in.
You know, you showed on the slide significant AP classes for the students. And one of the challenges in the United States is so many families are faced with huge debts, and the students are faced with huge debts. Do you have any idea of the savings that these families were able to attain based on the AP classes? Because that is a dramatic value.
So Florida has always been a leader in dual enrollment. We have a very vibrant community college system, and we may be the #1 or certainly in the top 5. So that's one way to get college credit. The second way is this AP courses. All the Florida universities at least accept AP courses as college credit. IB, a similar kind of approach. Now we're embedding these industrial credentialing elements, certificates inside the coursework where you can imagine a system moving forward where you get college credit high school credit, and a nationally recognized certificate. That's the ultimate thing. And then the final thing, there's an entity called Modern States. This is a guy, an entrepreneur and a philanthropist named Steve Klinsky, who basically has created an online program for all the CLEP tests. You remember the CLEP? You probably got, you started as a sophomore, didn't you?
Right, exactly.
Well, I actually did. Yep. So I CLEP'd out of my freshman year at the University of Texas, and back then it didn't cost anything. He gives this free to students. And there are a whole lot of students, and the universities have to, you know, they view this as a money loser, but the simple fact is if you're driven and motivated and you have the grit and determination to take these courses, you should start quicker. And the savings to families and to individuals is just huge.
You were talking about the idea of having high expectations and that accountability side. In that evaluating that success, you had to start from, you know, kind of ground zero. What were the first 2 or 3 areas that you were able to gain traction in that accountability in terms of evaluating success? Because you've got a couple that have to help get you off the ground.
Well, the biggest, that's absolutely right. So the big question we had, because no one had done this before, was where do you set the cut scores? Because there's a sweet spot somewhere where you want people to reach, but you don't want to. Governor Leroy Collins was my favorite governor in Florida, and he had a saying that a leader takes the boat out of the port but can't go over the horizon. Leaders need followers, and if you can't see what the leader's trying to do, you know, if the expectations are so high, they're so aspirational they're not going to achieve it, that's bad. But you got to leave the port. So finding the right cut score was important, and then having the courage or the conviction to, once we saw the success, to build, you know, to raise those cut scores was an element of this. But man, I was praying the rosary. The first we call it FCAT. It's the dreaded FCAT. It gave kids acne and all sorts of things. It's the state test for reading and math, and I literally did pray the rosary to see what the results were going to be. And thankfully, we had a big burst right out of the gate of success, which validated. Had we not had that first success, it might have been harder to take on the next iteration of reforms.
The momentum helps. Questions, but kind of 2 parts. Are charters graded in the system as well? And are all schools where public money follows the students held to the same accountability standards? Do they match or they run in parallel, I guess?
Great questions. Yes, on charter schools, they're graded the exact same way. They receive less money per student, but they're public schools, so they're in the accountability system. Initially, we had opportunity scholarships, which were, if schools were graded F 2 years out of 4 or 5, 2 years out of 4, a parent could send their kid to a higher performing public school or to a private school. And that was ruled unconstitutional. So those kids had to take the state test. But the corporate tax scholarship program, which has 10,000 students, the McKay scholarship program in Florida, if your child has a learning disability and you unilaterally do not believe your child's IED, individual education plan, is being met, you can go to any school you want, public or private. There's no test requirement if you go to a private there. So it's a mix. There's states that have done this. Indiana has a voucher program with higher income kids can participate in it. They require the test, and it's kind of slowed down their progress in some ways. So I think transparency, first of all, if a parent decides to send their kid to a school, as long as they know they have the information about the school, that's a pretty good accountability measure in some ways, because ultimately, if they're happy with the school, then that should be good enough. I think if you get private schools too immersed in the public setting, you know, I worked in government for 8 years. I just don't trust it.
A little complicated. Here's a question. How did you increase the parent participation?
You know, the parent participation became important because if you were an underperforming school, the principal, first of all, if you were F or D, typically the first thing that happens is your principal got fired. Because the superintendent wanted to have someone who was on fire, really highly energetic, to be able to turn the school around. And my experience was that the principal took care of that, because they really needed the total connectivity with the schools. So there was, in working neighborhoods, it's not always easy to find volunteers. You have to work harder to make it happen. But it's an essential part of a successful school for sure. I think that's probably waned a bit. I don't know that for a fact, and that would be a problem. I think it's, without parental involvement, this becomes a real struggle. Now, on the other hand, there are technological tools. Remember, in 1999, Al Gore had barely invented the internet, so it was like, that guy, he's, just for the record, I use that joke all the time, everybody laughs. He's had a great life of accomplishment, but I don't know how he got claimed the internet thing. It's pretty, but now you have these technological tools, right? Right. You can stay connected in ways that everybody can, and I think that's one of the real benefits of trying to do something now.
Great. We have issues in looking at it in terms of how did you bring the teachers along the journey, and then what was the interaction between the teachers at the teaching level and the union leadership? Did they march along in concert, or were they marching to different drummers? How would you describe those two factors?
Well, I would mark the teachers union down as neutral on this, like really violently neutral. I don't know if you see that. They weren't neutral. They hated it. They hated the whole thing. Totally. I mean, this is war. If you're going to move to a student-centered system, the economic interests of the adults have to be considered for sure, but they can't be the primary reason why we have, you know, what we have. And so that, they opposed it. They opposed it, and they opposed the school choice elements, and they opposed the accountability. One of the things that I learned was to get better about communicating the benefits of this. You can't just say, eat your broccoli, eat your broccoli, eat your broccoli, and that's, you know, it's just like, you're, you know, just banging people with this tough accountability system. You have to give bonuses for job well done. You bonus the teachers when they, you know, teach AP classes. A lot of these teachers didn't even teach AP classes. They had to be trained to do it. But they're pulling down $3,000 or $5,000 in some cases more. And that kind of separates the union from the teachers, and I think that's part of it. We found that the, I don't know if in Michigan if you have this, but Teachers of the Year at every school, in every district, and then you have a state Teacher of the Year. We found Teachers of the Year was a great place to recruit teachers to embrace these reforms because they weren't fearful of them. They were great teachers. They didn't feel like, oh, this is unfair. They said, this is great. Our kids are going to learn more. And so we had a disproportionate number of teacher supporters that were Teachers of the Year. But I would say, even today, that teachers generally, the union principally, is opposed to any kind of school choice or accountability.
If you go back to the beginning and look at it from our perspective, you had this passion yourself. It's something that you had interest in. Did you develop a coalition to help you make that progress from the very beginning?
Yes.
Or tell me about who was in the coalition, how that came together, and how we might consider something along that here.
Well, I'd say the coalition was comprised of advocates of parental choice and the business community. The business community in the early days stuck their necks out because, I mean, as you consider this, you'll get a call, shop warden, someone will call and say, your business, we frequent your business. Why are you doing this? We could make it hard on you. And so having the business community, the Florida Chamber, AIF, and others be supportive from the very beginning was hugely important.
Okay.
You know else was advocates, as long as we didn't get into their kitty litter, higher ed.
Oh, good.
As long as the higher ed, it's like, if you start, I'm actually for accountability for higher education as well, but that's for another day, I think.
I'll make this the last question. First, before I say it's the last question, great questions out there, so thank you, but you can't ask any more. You did a heck of a job, but you're done. I'm not doing any more. In West Michigan, people are inclined to say the educators know best. How would you comment on that statement?
All I know is that we have great teachers, We need to pay them more when they have their students gain a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time. We need to get them out of the classroom if they give a half a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time. The difference between a high-quality teacher and a mediocre teacher could be one grade level difference in the life of a child. And if you lose the lottery and have 2 years in a row where you have a bad teacher, those gaps aren't overcome. So let's pay teachers that are in the underserved areas, let's pay teachers that are in the underserved courses, and let's pay teachers that are high performers consistently a lot more. And let's give remediation for the teachers that are struggling, and if they can't get better, they should be fired.
Yep.
That's
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff.